falling for a trick like that." Burns's last words were the acme of biting sarcasm. " You admit yourself that he is too clever for you to put your hands on." " And then," went on Burns, not heeding the interruption, " he invites you to lunch, and tells you what he wants you to do for him, and you follow his lead like a sheep at the tail of the bell wether. Great Scott, Ormiston, I would give a year's salary for 1 hour's conversation with that man." Ormiston was beginning to see the part his queer character had played, but he was in a semi hysterical state, and, like a woman in such a position, he wanted a calm mind to tell him the whole thing in words of one syllable, to verify his own dread. " What do you mean ?" he asked. " I don't quite follow. You say he tells me what he wants me to do?" Burns shrugged his shoulders in disgust. Then, as if resigned to the task before him, he began his explanation. " Here, man, I will draw a diagram for you. This gentleman friend of yours, we will call him John Smith for convenience, wants to get possession of this white ruby. He knows that it is in the keeping of Mrs. Billy Wentworth. He knows you know Mrs. Wentworth, and have access to her house. He knows that she stole this bauble, and is frightened to death all the time. Now John Smith is a pretty clever chap. He handled the great Ormiston like hot putty. He had exhausted his resources. He is baffled and needs help. What does he do? He reads the stories about the great Godahl. Confidently, Mr. Ormiston, I will tell you that I think your great Godahl is mush. But that is neither here nor there. If you can sell him as a gold brick, all right. But Mr. John Smith is struck by the wonderful ingenuity of this Godahl. He says, * Ha! I will get Godahl to tell me how to get this gem.' So he gets a hold of yourself, sir, and persuades you that you are playing a joke on him by getting him to rant and rave about the great Godahl. Then, and here the villain enters, he says, * Here is a thing the great Godahl cannot do. I dare him to do it.' He tells you about the gem, whose very existence is quite fantastic enough to excite the imagination of the wonderful Ormiston. And by clever suggestion he persuades you to lay the plot at the home of Mrs. Wentworth. And all the time you are chuckling to yourself, thinking what a rare joke you are going to have on J. Borden Benson when you send him an autographed copy, and show him that he was talking to the distinguished genius all the time, and didn't know it. That's the whole story, sir." Burns sat back in his chair and regarded Ormiston with the smile a pedagogue bestows on a refractory boy whom he has just flogged soundly. " I will explain further," he continued. " You haven't visited the house yet. You can't. Mrs. Wentworth, for all she is in bed with 4 dozen hot water bottles, would tear you limb from limb if you went there. And don't think for a moment she isn't able to. That woman is a vixen." Ormiston nodded gloomily. The very thought of her now sent him into a cold sweat. " Mr. Godahl, the obliging," continued the deputy, " notes one thing to begin with. The house cannot be entered from the outside, so it must be an inside job. How can this be accomplished? Well, there is the deaf butler. Why is he deaf? Godahl ponders. Ha! he has it. The Wentworths are so dependent on servants that they must have them round at all times. This butler is the one who is constantly about them. They are worried to death by their possession of this white ruby. Their house has been raided from the inside a dozen times. Nothing is taken, mind you. They suspect their servants. This thing haunts them, but the woman will not give up this foolish bauble. So she has as her major domo a man who cannot understand a word in any language unless he is looking at the speaker and is in a bright light. He can only understand the lips. Handy, isn't it? In a dull light, or with their backs turned, they can talk about anything they want. This is a jewel of a butler." " But," added Burns, " one day a man calls. He is a lawyer. He tells the butler he is heir to a fortune, $50,000. He must go to Ireland to claim it. Your friend on the train he is the man, of course sends your butler to Ireland. So this precious butler is lost. They must have another. Only a deaf one will do. And they find just the man they want. Quite accidentally, you understand. Of course it is Godahl, with forged letters, saying he has been in service in great houses. Presto ! The great Godahl himself is now the butler. It is simple enough to play deaf. You say this is fiction. Let me tell you this. 6 weeks ago the Wentworths actually changed butlers. That hasn't come out in the papers yet. Ormiston, who had listened to the deputy's review of his story listlessly, now sat up with a start. He suddenly exclaimed gleefully, " But my story didn't come out until 2 days ago." " Ah, yes, but you forget that it has been in the hands of your publishers for 3 months. A man who was clever enough to dupe the great Ormiston wouldn't shirk the task of getting hold of a proof of that story." Ormiston sank deeper into his chair. Once Godahl got inside the house, the rest was simple. He corrupted one of the servants. He opened the steel lined door with the flame of an oxyacetylene blast. As you say in your story, that flame cut steel like wax. He didn't have to bother about the lock. He simply cut the door down. Then he put his confederate in good humor by telling him to fill his pockets with the diamonds and other junk in the safe, which he obligingly opens. One thing bothers me, Ormiston. How did you find out about that infernal contraption that killed the confederate?" Ormiston buried his face in his hands. Burns rudely shook him. " Come," he said, " you murdered that man, though you are innocent. Tell me how." " Is this the third degree ?" asked Ormiston. " It looks like it," said the deputy grimly, as he knotted his stubby mustache. Ormiston drew a long breath, like one who realizes how hopeless is his situation. He began to speak in a low tone. All the while the deputy glared at Godahl s inventor with his accusing eye. " When I was sitting in the treasure room with the Wentworths and my wife, playing auction bridge, I dismissed the puzzle of the door as easily solved by means of the brazing flame. The problem was not to get into the house or into this room, but to find the ruby. It was not in the safe." " No, of course not. I suppose your friend on the train was kind enough to tell you that. He probably looked there himself." " Gad, he did tell me that, come to think of it. Well, I studied that room. I was sure the white ruby, if it really existed, was within 10 feet of me. I examined the floor, the ceilings, the walls. No result. But," he said, shivering as if in a draught of cold air, " there was a chest in that room made of Lombardy oak." The harassed author buried his face in his hands. " Oh, this is terrible !" he moaned. " Go on," said the deputy, in his colorless voice. " I can't. I tell it all in the story. Heaven help me !"" I know you tell it all in the story," came the rasping voice of Burns. " But I want you to tell it to me. I want to hear it from your own lips, as Ormiston, you understand, whose deviltry has just killed a man, not as your damnable Godahl." " The chest was not solid oak," went on Ormiston. " It was solid steel, covered with oak to disguise it." " How did you know that?" " I had seen it before." "Where?" " In Italy, 15 years ago, in a decayed castle, back through the Soldini Pass from Lugano. It was the possession of an old nobleman, a friend of mine." " Hm !" grunted the deputy. And then, " Well, how did you know it was the same one?" " By the inscription carved on the front. It was But I have told you all this in print already. Why need I go over it all again?" " I want to hear it again from your own lips. Maybe there are some points you did not tell in print. Go on." " The inscription was Sanctus Dominus." The deputy smiled grimly. " Very fitting, I should say. Praise the Lord, with the most diabolical engine of destruction I have ever seen." " And then," said Ormiston, " there was the owner s name, Arno Petroni. Queer name, that." " Yes," said the deputy, dryly. " How did you hit on this as the receptacle for the white ruby?" " If it were the same one I saw in Lugano, and I felt sure it was.